How's it going, everybody? Welcome back. This is another locally sourced interview. I'm your host, Carter. You would be so kind as to take a moment and subscribe to the channel. If you appreciate the content, you want to support it, help the channel keep going and expand, you can head over to patreon.com/locally sourced, or now we are on Substack with locally sourced nh.substack.com. And we do very low barrier to entry, $3 or $5 a month lets you in. We try to keep it below the standard media outlet in the state in terms of costs, and nothing is ever paywalled. So don't feel like you're being excluded from content just because you can't afford it. Information is valuable, and therefore everybody should be able to have access to it. But with that out of the way, today my guest is State Rep Tom Oppel from Canaan, and he is also a former advisor to the Obama administration, and stumbling over my words. But yeah, so Tom, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Carter. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm really excited to speak with you today. So think let's start off by just sort of introducing you to folks. You have a really interesting history in politics. Just starting out as a teacher and moving into journalism, and then doing consulting and work with the Obama administration, and now you're a state rep in New Hampshire. So just help us sort of understand your story a little bit.
Well, sometimes, Carter, I joke that there are people who would accuse me of not being able to keep a job. Um, the uh, the the pathway makes more sense once you sort of. My first job out of college, as you said, was teaching sixth grade English down in Hudson, New Hampshire, and sometimes, particularly for public employees and teachers, the state takes the live free or die motto a little too seriously and literally. Um,
Yeah.
and so you know, um, needed to earn some extra money to pay my bills, and of course needed a job in the summer. And there was an ad for part-time correspondence for the National Telegraph, and this would have been the fall of 1976. Um, I know I look younger than that, but um, at any rate, so I started, part time working for the Telegraph, covering the towns of Litchfield and Londonderry, going to select board meetings, going to zoning board meetings, planning board meetings, fire and police, um, and did that for a year and a half, and then they offered me a full time job. And as luck would have it, it was the the guy who had been the political reporter was promoted to regional editor, and so I stepped right into covering politics. And I did that for a couple of years for the Telegraph, and then I went to work for United Press International in Concord and covered the New Hampshire House and Senate and politics for several years. And at some point, UPI went through a succession of sales, and each new owner seemed slightly less financially stable than the previous owner. And it just
Yeah.
kind of, and and a friend of mine who was working for Gannett News Service in DC let me know that the newspaper chain Gannett had just purchased the statewide newspaper in Mississippi, and they were looking for a political reporter. And I, as an English major and a fan of Faulkner and Richard Wright, um, and a political junkie in terms of loving the impact that Southern politics had on the country. I thought, so I went down and I interviewed and I got the job. And so for 2 years, I worked covering politics in Mississippi, which having done political journalism for almost 10 years, um, another friend called me and said, would you think about shifting over to actually, instead of covering a campaign, working in a campaign? And I went to work, and I ultimately did that. Started a succession of, I worked for a woman who was running for governor of Tennessee. We finished second in the primary. And ultimately, the guy who won the primary ultimately became governor, Ned McWhorter. And then I went back to Mississippi and went to work for a guy named Mike Espy, who was ultimately elected the first African American congressman from Mississippi since Reconstruction. And a year later, I went to work for a 39-year-old Harvard Law grad who was had won election as a state auditor in 1983, and we had gotten to be friendly. And I went to work for him as his press secretary, and he ultimately won the governorship. And then I, went on and started doing political consulting, and I did that until in 2009, my friend, the former Mississippi governor, was nominated to be the Secretary of the Navy by President Obama. And he had previously served as the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia in the Clinton administration, and he tried to get me to go to Riyadh with him. And I had just made partner in this D.C. political consulting firm, and so I turned him down. And when he called me in 2009 about the Navy job, he said, "You can't turn me down twice." So I ended up spending 8 years at the Pentagon, which was in many ways the best job I've ever had. It was mission driven, just incredible. There was literally no aspect of domestic policy that didn't touch the Navy and Marine Corps. And so, we were very involved in, my boss, the secretary, was very instrumental in pushing renewable energy, the use of renewable energy. He was, and we see it today in what's happening in I guess now the almost concluded, the sort of concluded war with Iran,
Yeah.
and in Ukraine, the use of drones. My boss famously went before a group of aviators, and this was 2014, 2015, and basically said the F-35, which is a really expensive manned fighter.
Right.
But he said the F-35 would be the last manned plane that Navy would build, that we were moving to drones and unmanned.
Probably a good thing. I feel like
Which
I've heard some sort of like he did tenuous assessments of the safety and efficacy of the F-35 in terms of just its the maintenance costs and operating costs versus its how well it operates. I understand that it's sort of like the next gen fighter jet, but it sounds like there's a lot of overhead with those things.
a tremendous amount of overhead, and the fact of the matter is, we see the efficacy of unmanned drones, and their ability to even in an asynchronous environment, Russia and Ukraine clearly are not on equal levels in terms of their ability to bring resources militarily.
Right.
But Ukraine has done an enormously admirable job, I think, of being able to not only hold its own, but it now appears that they're actually, to some degree, gaining the upper hand. And so, one of the things that I used to say when I was at the Pentagon was the whole world was going smaller, faster, cheaper, but the U.S. military seemed still to be locked into a slower, more expensive, takes longer
Right.
production model. And so I think one of the things that, I was reading a column yesterday in the New York Times about um, what the war has hopefully demonstrated uh, to the U.S. is that we've got to rethink, we've got to rethink what we're doing. We
Yeah,
can't
yeah,
we
absolutely.
can't keep relying on these very expensive weapons programs that take forever, and you quickly deplete your ability to compete.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We got to be careful talking about that though, because we've got a lot of weapons manufacturers here in the state of New Hampshire that might get a little upset if we push on that one a little too hard. But it's
Well, the truth is, I mean, I think those companies need to, and I think to some degree they are. Um, they're trying to adjust to a changing world and a changing environment. And the question is not so much the industrial base, I think, as it is uh, the folks who are purchasing the systems. And so, to some degree, you've got to, it's like any business. You've got to respond to your customers' desires,
right.
and so um, I think to some degree, the folks who are purchasing the weapons, need to be rethinking their approach here.
Yeah, yeah, I certainly agree with that, and I think I mean there may very well be some sort of space between our positions on this, and I'm totally fine with that. I'm just sort of like I think about looking at it from the outside, right? Obviously I have no no love for Russia in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. I also just generally like, I understand sort of the technological advancements of drone warfare and what that means. And, we definitely, I think the United States is reeling right now from the efficacy of the Shahed drone program that Iran has rolled out, and if you look to Ukraine, they're able to buy just sort of like consumer grade Alibaba drones and hook grenades and AK-47s up to them and go out and if I don't necessarily encourage people to do this because it's quite horrific. But there's a wealth of um, FPV drone footage where you can actually see what real combat looks like right now, and it's generally quite horrific. And I think we would see a massive change in opinion in the United States if all of a sudden that footage coming back wasn't Ukrainian or Russian soldiers sort of just having to abandon their lives because no man can outrun a drone. If we were to say put boots on the ground in Iran, like
Mm-hmm.
that's a big concern that I have, and I think to see that sort of technical advancement of warfare should definitely be a bit of a warning to the public. Never mind the financial aspects of it, the degree to which we invest in our sort of national defense spending at again at the expense of things like healthcare, infrastructure, housing, stuff like that. Things that we will subsidize other nations. Like I think the most obvious example would be Israel in terms of sending them a lot of military support while they have nationalized healthcare and we don't. And so I think there's a lot of Americans that they're picking up the tab for that. And for that to then come back to them as FPV drone footage of their sons and daughters being just killed by drone warfare, I have a feeling that would leave a bad taste in a lot of Americans' mouths.
Sure. And I think I view this as, well, having worked for the Navy and the Marine Corps. Um, the analogy that I always tried to use with people was, we would talk about naval presence. Um, we have, you know, we have a Navy. It probably needs to be bigger. Um, but I always thought of the Navy as sort of akin to the policeman on a beat, out on the streets, getting to know the neighbors, getting to know the businesses, understanding what, if a door was ajar, it looked, something looked wrong, the officer would understand it. Um,
Mhm.
and the Navy is, the U.S. Navy has been like that for 70 plus years. Um, we have been the one, really, for the first time in human history that I know of. We have been the U.S. Navy has been the folks who kept sea lanes open,
Right.
including the Strait of Hormuz. Um, but we didn't do it for just our own advantage. It wasn't we weren't only allowing U.S. ships, commercially or otherwise. Um, it was available globally to all nations, including nations who weren't necessarily our friends. Um, and that's what's in to a large degree kept us from the horrors of the two world wars at the first half of the 20th century. Um, Unfortunately, I think that's changing, and I think we need to change with it, and we need to understand the consequences. One of the changes that I think, and I'm not sure people have really thought this through. I haven't seen any work on this, but one of the things that is of concern is the more you automate war with unmanned drones, and even I heard a story. I think it was on NPR the other night about Ukrainians building robots to actually conduct warfare. Instead of sending a human, they would send a robot out to fire on Russian troops.
Mhm.
Um, the more that happens, the less distasteful in some ways war becomes, I think. Um, if it's not humans who are actively engaged in war, we're just using machines. Um, it becomes. I think we become desensitized to the conflict potentially. So I think that's something for somebody else to think about, going on down the road. My days of military thinking are probably over.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, for what it's worth, I tend to take a much more sort of soft power emphasized track. I think that, like I just my general attitude towards conflict in general is that we spend a lot of energy and a lot of money, whether there's people involved or not. We put so much emphasis on viewing the world through a lens of conflict and not through a lens of diplomacy. And I think for us to be able to move forward, it, spanning from locally to globally, right? Because I generally try not to draw too many specific distinctions between your town local politics and sort of international geopolitical operations, right? Because they're all part of the same thing. It's all part of a larger organism that is humanity and Earth, right? And there's ways that ties into the stewardship of the planet itself in terms of our ability to continue living on it. And then there's also sort of the impact of just the respect of the sovereignty of nations and the general attitude of is it really the best way for us to operate the United States is Team America World Police, the joke of South Park back in the day, the creators of South Park with that film. And I think
Mm.
there's a lot of I think there's a lot of space to reevaluate the way that could operate. I think, say what you will, I think China does a very interesting. It serves as a very interesting example for the way to demonstrate soft power through manufacturing and economic support, trade deals, things like that, where it is very non-conflict oriented. The amount of military bases they have globally is far less than the United States, and I think there's a very solid argument to be made that, like, once you cross over a certain line, a U.S. military base in a foreign nation ends up becoming sort of like a missile sponge for for conflict, and that's and then what does that mean for the host country that's allowed this United States military base to operate within their borders, where all of a sudden it's rather than providing an opportunity for protection, it paints a target on their back, and and it alarms that that nation, and I just wonder that maybe there's a better way to sort of respect the sovereignty of other nations while understanding that we all share this planet together, and there are existential problems that we face currently, like a climate crisis, a burgeoning climate crisis, a oceanic extinction event, things like that that are seriously going to affect our ability to inhabit this planet, stay fed. We're looking at millions of people dying over climate change events, and I mean, and that's not just happening internationally. We have examples of that. If you look to the Midwest, in 2025, there was a big La Nina event, which caused a massive interaction of cold and warm airflows, which caused a string of storms. You're looking at hundreds and hundreds of tornadoes that are ripping through the Midwest, killing Americans. It's you've got hurricane events that are just incredible. Think of 2022 and Hurricane Ian and the amount of damage that caused to Florida. This stuff is very real and very much so impacting the lives of people in this country here and now. So I know that's a lot of moving pieces to consider. And again, it's not very, this isn't very local New Hampshire politics of us to talk about, but again,
But it
it's
impacts
difficult
us.
to parse.
Well, and Carter, but you're exactly right. It's the butterfly effect, or maybe it's the butterfly effect in reverse. The
Yeah,
fact is that um, look, people in New Hampshire are paying more at the gas pump because of global events. I had an opportunity. That one of the pieces of legislation that came before us this year. New Hampshire has had a renewable energy fund um, paid for with a small uh, a fee, basically, essentially that electric utilities were paying into this fund, and the idea was that the fund would help um, mainly public sector, schools and government entities um, begin to convert to renewable energy, solar, hydro, etc. And there's no question electric rates are increasing, and it's having an impact on people's wallets. Um,
right.
the answer the answer from the majority was to drain the renewable energy fund and give the money back to ratepayers. But ratepayers were going to get pennies. It wasn't going to have any real impact on people's wallets. But what it is going to do is basically drain the renewable energy fund of its ability to help fund these projects. And um, when the bill came before, I sit on the House Ways and Means Committee, and when the bill came before us, because there was a financial aspect to it, um, one of the things that I pointed out was I had the opportunity to ask a representative from the state, the New Hampshire Department of Energy, and I asked her point blank. I said, "How many oil drilling rigs are there in the state of New Hampshire?" And she said, "None." I said, "Okay,
Yeah.
and how many? How much drilling do we do? How many jobs are created with drilling for natural gas?" And she said, "None." And I said, "And how many jobs are involved in the solar energy industry in New Hampshire?" And she said, "Well, I don't have a specific number, but it's certainly in the thousands." And I
Right.
said, "Okay, so we're going to put more money in the pockets of fossil fuel companies that that we're not producing any fossil fuel, but we sure are producing sun and wind, and um, that's creating jobs here in New Hampshire." But I mean, I didn't even want to get to the consequences of, burning fossil fuels, which are, as
Right.
you pointed out, horrific. And one of these days, um, there's going to be a congressional hearing where you have, the CEO of Exxon and Chevron and BP, and they're going to be testifying just like the tobacco company executives were forced to do ultimately, and just say, yeah, we're killing people, but we're making a profit, so we don't really care.
Yeah. Well, and
Um,
I mean, I think in a lot of ways we're at a point where they're sort of they're almost sort of at at a point where they say that kind of stuff anyways.
yeah, we're
It's all
we're
very
pretty
out in the
close.
open. Yeah.
Yeah,
But this actually we could probably talk about this all day, but I do want to sort of get to some other things here. And
sure.
this actually is I think a great place to pivot because you brought up that you sit on the Ways and Means Committee, which I
Hmm.
think for anybody watching who's that can be a bit obfuscatory of a term like just for the public in terms of understanding what the Ways and
Sure.
Means Committee actually does. And it's you kind of have to take a second to think about it, but it's the way and the means by which we fund anything, right? So you guys are sort of
Right.
responsible for interacting with like the mechanism by which money is raised to be allocated to specific initiatives that the state of New Hampshire takes in order to get something done, right? So
Exactly.
in a lot of ways, you
Exactly.
touch everything that's related to tax policy.
Taxes, fees, essentially. So the New Hampshire legislature, serves 2-year terms. Um, this November of 2026 will elect a new House and Senate, um, and maybe a new governor, or reelect the current governor. Um, and in the 2-year biennium, the way the process works is, um, in New Hampshire, as is true of the U.S. Congress, all money bills, all tax bills have to start in the House. Um, the idea is that the House is bigger and it's more representative of the people. So in January 2027, and I am not running for reelection, so I get to miss the pleasure of this process. But in January of 27, the Ways and Means Committee will start meeting, and they will basically sit down with uh, basically all of the department heads, who are responsible for bringing in revenue. The director of the lottery, the head of the Department of Revenue Administration, um, along with probably people from the Boston branch of the Federal Reserve Bank, other economists, and make a decision through January and February. The Ways and Means Committee will basically develop a recommendation, projection for how much revenue the state will bring in from its various sources. The largest source for the state are the two business taxes: the business profits tax, and then the business enterprise tax, which is more focused on, um, how many employees you have, and it's less about strictly profitable. As there were some companies that were essentially able to avoid any liability, through some bookkeeping techniques, perfectly legal, but nonetheless. And so they created the business enterprise tax. So those two taxes are the single largest. It's about a third of the revenue raised by the state comes from them, and then it's obviously, we have a whole series of, the state liquor commission, the sale of alcohol, the sale of cigarettes and tobacco, the lottery commission, which, um, not only regulates the New Hampshire lottery but also regulates now, essentially casino gambling,
Yeah, yeah,
and
Kino,
and
things
the
like that.
online, right, and the online gambling now. In New Hampshire, we have an arrangement with, an organization called DraftKings that you can bet sports on your phone. Um, so
Yeah.
um,
I think a lot of the
so
younger folks will know exactly who DraftKings is.
yeah, I know my two sons both, have it on their phones, and
Yeah.
but it's I think it's of concern. I think there's a growing gambling addiction problem,
Yeah.
particularly with the aspect of online betting. And
Yep.
when I mean it's insidious in many ways, and so it's of real concern. But that's what the Ways and Means Committee basically functions to to consider and then ultimately recommend. Here's how much revenue we think is going to be collected in the next 2 years. Based on that recommendation, recommendation then goes to the House Finance Committee, which is responsible for preparing the spending side, the budget, based
Right.
on the revenue recommendations that Ways and Means has given them. And then, so then the House will come up and ultimately the full House will vote on a budget, which then goes over to the Senate. And for reasons that I'm still not quite sure, the protocol in the House is never to say the word Senate. We always say the other body or the folks behind the wall. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know what that's about, but that's the protocol. So then the other body gets its chance to review the revenue recommendations and the spending recommendations. They'll come up with their version, and then the two chambers will meet and agree. Either the House would accept the Senate's version, or they would ask for a committee of conference, and they would meet and hammer out an agreeable budget, which then goes to the governor for signature, or um,
Or
it's
veto.
rare when a governor vetoes, but it does happen.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think so. This actually might be a bit more complex of a follow up, but here we go. So I think this interacts very directly with sort of the general. You're a supporter of the 3-3 tax affordability plan,
I
which
am.
I just in doing some research, I was looking at you know vote smart, citizens count, stuff like that. They had said that originally you were actually not a supporter of an income tax in the state, which I thought was interesting because that wasn't what my understanding of your position was right now. Relatively beside the point. But if that is true and there was an evolution there, I'd definitely be curious to hear sort of what that trajectory was like for you personally. But moreover, I think it's you just had this really interesting amendment that you had proposed, the CACR 12, which there's some funny, in my opinion, funny articles coming from sort of the right wing media in the state, specifically New Hampshire Journal, about you making that proposal. And there was a quote in there that I thought was very funny, where you're like, well, at least I managed to get the two parties to unite on something. So that was entertained me to no end. But and I've made no bones about the fact that, like, for me as a much lower income renting working class member of the state, who's like, I live in a town that I grew up in. I've been here for over 3 decades. And I don't want to leave. And I'm interested in exploring other taxation options that would allow for people like me to be able to stay in our communities. And I think an income tax is very much so a decent path to it. And while I do feel that there are certain ways that, the revenue generated and sort of the split on the over under, people can go back and watch the interview that I did with Andrew and Cliff about this if they want to get more specific context to it. I think reinstating things like interest and dividends tax and inheritance tax, stuff like that, I think those things would help to sort of pad out the disparity that still exists even after the offsets that the 3-3 tax plan provides, which has carve outs for lower income families, so that if you're making under a certain amount, you're not going to pay that income tax anyways. It doesn't really matter.
Right.
And so, but generally, like, there's sort of the follow up thought that I think you actually articulated very well just now that a lot of people miss. And I think this is really important, that we can change the way that we structure taxing in this state so that we're generating more revenue in a more fair way. But if that tax money doesn't get spent in an adequate way once it reaches the state house, then it will give the illusion to the public, especially if it's sort of spun and branded in a way that it's like the government's taking your money and they're doing nothing with it, and there's, look how bad the government is. And, like, there's sort of two sides to the coin of, like, yes, the collection needs to be equitable and reasonable in a way that doesn't string out or the public, but it also needs to be allocated and spent in a way that doesn't that actually benefits the public. And, so you can have an improved tax situation, right? Like, you can say, okay, we're going to do a statewide income tax, which allows the opportunity for towns to then reduce their property tax rates, right? But that then, sort of like in classic New Hampshire fashion of downshifting, re reallocates the emphasis and responsibility to town selectmen to then actually cut their local property tax rates. It's like, and the state can be kind of like hands off about, like, hey, like, we did our part, if they're still asking an arm and a leg for you. And I think that's where a lot of the general conservative criticism, when they point to states like Connecticut and they're like, look, well, like, they did the income tax and look how out of hand it got. You know what I mean? It's like, well, yeah, because the other work that needed to be done in concert with the sort of top level reallocation of taxation didn't happen. And so, to me, it's like there's a lot of nuance about the ways in which tax money is collected and then allocated and then spent. It just gets left out. And so I know that I really went on a ramble here, but to me, it's important to, like, provide all this context, because I don't see anybody in media trying to help the public along to this understanding of the ways in which things work on the inside, and then asking people who are elected to weigh in on it that would know about it. So I know that's a lot, but if you're able to sort of speak on it a bit, I would appreciate it.
Sure. Well, let me start with the reference you made, and I can't remember whether it's VoteSmart or Citizens Count, or one of those sites that said I'm opposed
Yeah.
to a broad-based tax. Um,
Ballotpedia or something like that. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And the truth is, when I ran in 2024, I told people that I was not in favor of an income or sales tax. Um, in part because I didn't understand the issue as well as I think I do now. Not that I'm an expert by any means, I'm still learning. Um, but at the time, I you know, at the time, what I was focused on, I did talk to people about revenue, and the two things that I brought up with with the people I knocked on almost 1,000 doors in my district, in three towns: Canaan, Dorchester, Orange, and they're all rural. Um, we have a substantial portion of people who live below the poverty line. Um, there are a lot of folks who are struggling, and what I clearly heard was the top issue was the increase in property taxes. And it's clear that one of the things that has been happening over the last 10 years with the Republican majority is they have been cutting taxes, which is their political slogan. We're
Right.
Republicans. We're for cutting taxes. The Democrats are for raising your taxes. Um, and that's the mantra we've lived with going back to 1972 and the first time Mel Thompson ran for governor. The pledge to
Yeah.
veto a sales or income tax or oppose a sales or income tax.
Uh,
Um, and it became sort of this thoughtless, empty political slogan that didn't mean anything. What I talked about, though, and I said I wanted to try to do something about property tax relief. And the two things that I talked about, one was restoring the interest and dividends tax. Um, which was $180 million in revenue that got eliminated by the Republican majority, and restoring some of the tax cuts that had been made to the business taxes, largely paid by the wealthiest companies. It's not mom and pop stores that are paying business profits or business enterprise tax. It's Amazon
Right.
and Walmart and ExxonMobil and et cetera. It's huge corporations that, frankly, the tax cut that they got was, there was a term in the Pentagon where billions of dollars gets tossed around like it's real money. The tax cut to Exxon, the New Hampshire tax cut to ExxonMobil was budget dust.
Right.
They didn't recognize it. And the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute has done a study and said, it's upwards of $1 billion in lost revenue over the last 10 years with no concurrent increase in business activity. So we cut their taxes, but we didn't, it wasn't like suddenly, we were rolling in dough because more businesses were coming into the state and hiring, et cetera. One of the interesting things that I pointed out to a witness who is head of a right-wing think tank and is always promoting lower taxes. One of the things that I pointed out to him that over the last 10 years, according to statistics we got from an economist as part of the process of developing the revenue recommendations in 2025, was gross domestic product, the increase in GDP in New Hampshire was the second highest in New England. The first highest, Massachusetts.
Right.
And it was like, okay, so I guess Massachusetts must be doing something right. So to me, one of the things that I campaigned on in 2024 was, yes, we need revenue. Yes, we need property tax relief. One of the things that I introduced a bill, and I got 50 plus votes on it, but no, I got more than that. But it's a bill called Global Reporting, and essentially, it would stop allowing companies to offshore their profits and to claim, well, yes, we did so much business in New Hampshire, but we had to pay a licensing fee to our corporate headquarters in tax-free Cayman Islands.
Yeah.
So they use bookkeeping techniques to shift profits out of a tax liability. Again, perfectly legal, but not fair.
Right.
So my point was in 2024 that I wanted to focus on trying to get property tax relief for my constituents and for the state. It used to be when property taxes were first imposed in New Hampshire, people's homes weren't taxed.
Right.
What was taxed was revenue producing property. So
Exactly.
if you had a barn and you were you were selling milk and you had cows in your barn got taxed. That was the property tax, and it was
Right.
based on value, which, when you think about it, is really a form of an income tax, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But somehow we've evolved, and now you have a property tax that gets imposed for most people, for average people. Their home is their single largest investment, their
Right.
single largest capital investment. But it is the only capital investment that gets taxed on your current market value, whether you realize that value or not. So
Right.
if you have a share of Apple and the stock goes up, 10% in a year, you don't get taxed on that increase in value on that stock until you sell
Right.
it.
Exactly.
But your home, if your home increases in value by 10% in 1 year, the tax assessor comes and goes, "Oh, well, good to see you're doing okay, Thomas. Here's your tax bill. It's up by 10%." because
Right.
the value of your home is increased by 10. But I haven't done anything to realize that increase. I'm just
Exactly.
enjoying my home.
You're not benefiting in the meantime from that
E-
increased value. You'd only
exactly.
benefit if you sold.
Exactly. And so, in the first year, I tried in several different ways um, to tackle what I thought was the basic unfairness of the property tax. Um, and there are all sorts of statistics, and I won't get into the weeds, but fundamentally, um, uh, in probably by the summer of 2025, after the first session, I realized we had to do something different, and I got involved with a group um, run by your former guest Andrew Valinsky, and it was a group of us who were interested in the idea of reforming the tax system in New Hampshire. So what? And I have had conversations going back to December of 24, where I told party leaders in my own party. Um, the Democratic Party needs to become the party of property tax cuts, property tax relief. Uh,
Yep.
the system, New Hampshire relies on property taxes more than any other state to fund services. And you're right. Essentially, what it does is it pushes the burden down onto local cities and towns and school districts, um, which the state, should be, and public education may be the best one. So New
Yeah.
Hampshire ranks
Prime
in the
example.
top 10 New Hampshire ranks in the top 10 for spending on public schools. You think, and the results are pretty good. I mean, comparatively speaking, New Hampshire students do well compared to other states, students in other states.
Right.
And being in the top 10 of spending, you'd think, okay, well, what's the problem? The problem is that most of that money comes from property taxes.
Right.
Um, New Hampshire is dead last, 50th out of 50 states, in terms of state support for public education. So, you know, the vast majority of the funds that are being raised are coming from property taxes. It became clear to me as you begin to look at this, what the framework has been with the pledge and the, you know, uh, is that Republicans are for tax cuts and Democrats want to raise your taxes. And what I have tried to talk about to our leadership over the last 2 years is to say our response to that framework has been no, we're not for raising taxes, which is A, not a positive message, and B, so what are you for? Well, we're for public schools and healthcare and childcare and housing, and okay, how are you going to pay for it? Well, we're not for raising taxes.
Yeah.
No, that's not an
Yeah.
answer. That's. So what I
Right.
said was, look, the Republicans have handed us a gift. We need to reframe this question. The answer is not, they say the frame is there for cutting and we're for raising. But the truth is, they've been raising property taxes over those last 10 years because they've been giving tax cuts to the very wealthiest people and companies in the state. They eliminated the interest and dividends tax, which was only paid by basically, 10% of the state, the 10% that was the wealthiest. They eliminated or they cut the business taxes, which only benefited, to the extent they even noticed, the Amazons and the Walmarts and the major corporations. Because most small businesses in the state weren't paying. They didn't get to the level. So we cut taxes for people who didn't need the tax cut, and we raised taxes for everybody else. So, the top 5%, is rolling in dough, and the rest, the other 95% are struggling. You
Right.
know, um, that makes no sense to me. So ultimately, our group began to look at, and it started really with the focus on how do we fund public schools? How do we change this, what I call reverse Robin Hood We're
Yeah.
taking from the poor and giving to the rich. Um, so we started focusing on that, and my participation was always I want to support public schools, and I think the state needs to do more. But my focus is cutting property taxes. People are struggling; they're losing their homes, they're having to sell. We got to focus on cutting property taxes. So the 3-3 plan that we came up with um, was there was nothing else. If you restore the interest and dividends tax, it's $180 million. We have essentially a $1 billion problem in terms of
Yeah.
funding, and so there was nothing. We looked at marijuana, we looked at restoring the interest and dividends tax. You could restore the business tax cuts back to the level they were at in
Right.
2015, and it's still not enough to really solve the problem, which led us to
Yeah.
the income tax. Now, let me say, Carter, three things that I think are critically important. And you pointed out the concern many people have about, well, you pass an income tax and my property taxes are still going to be up, and now I've got a new tax, and you're just adding a tax on other taxes. My response to that, and this goes to sort of my notion of CACR 12. CACR 12 started out as the free stater, I call the freeloaders, who who wanted to introduce a constitutional amendment, put on the ballot the question to try and ban an income tax from ever happening in the state of New Hampshire.
Right. The classic Jason Osborne line.
Exactly. And to me, now the response from Democratic leadership, they weren't happy with me because of my advocacy for the 3-3 plan, which they felt
Right.
like opened the door. To which my response is a line I learned in Mississippi: if we're so smart, how come we're broke?
Yeah.
And as I pointed out, the fear in the Democratic Party and the myth in the Democratic Party is, well, talking about an income tax is the third rail of politics. It'll get us beat. We'll lose if we talk about an income tax. To which my response is, in the last 30 years, the Democrats have held the majority in the House 4 times.
Right.
15 elections, we've won 4. 11-4 or 4-11 sort of looks like the current Red Sox record.
Yeah, I was gonna say 30% isn't exactly like a winning streak,
I mean, I think I calculated it was like a 230 batting average, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's not Hall of Fame numbers. And to my way of thinking, it's like, wait a second, you're afraid you're going to lose if you talk about this issue, but you're already losing.
Yeah.
What have you got? What have you got to lose? So maybe you would have
Yeah.
won 3 instead of 4. Or maybe if you'd made the argument, it's not they're for cutting and we're for raising. It's who's paying the tax, and they want the rich not to pay, and they want you to pick up the tab. And the Democrats, certainly me, my view is I think everybody ought to pay their fair share. Those with more should pay more. Those with less should pay less. And the beauty of the income tax, unlike your property tax, if you're in your home and you get your property tax bill and you have just lost your job, the tax assessor doesn't say, "Oh, Carter, okay, listen, I understand. You don't have to pay your property tax bill this
Right.
year.
Right.
We'll give you a break." Said no one ever.
Yeah,
But if you
exactly.
lose your job and there's an income tax, well, I don't have any income, so I don't have a tax, right?
Right.
The income tax is adjustable to your own circumstances. If you get divorced, if you get sick, your property tax bill doesn't change. The income
Right.
tax bill would. So that's first. The income tax is fairer. Second, in this when Jason Osborne proposed, no income tax ever. And the House Democratic leadership was, well, we're not for an income tax, but we're not for putting it in the Constitution either. So, and they were, it was a good political trick that Jason pulled. So I decided, and again, I didn't share this with my leadership because I knew what their response would be, and that made them even more angry. But I decided, if we're going to put this in the Constitution, let's give people a real opportunity, a legitimate question. And so the courts have ruled, based on the current Constitution, that we can't have a progressive tax. It has to be a
Right.
flat tax. Everybody gets the same rate. So what I proposed was a constitutional amendment to be voted on by the people that would do three things. First, it would permit a progressive tax so that the more you made, the higher your rate. You
Mhm.
could actually tax the very wealthiest at higher rates than, a middle class or working class family or individual. So progressivity. Second was requiring the revenue raised from the income tax to go to public schools to increase the state's share of support for public schools. And the third element, and this to me was critical, the third element was a requirement that whatever additional revenue a school district received all three elements would be in the Constitution. So what I was trying to do was
Just really
get
quick,
to,
Tom. Do you mind
sure,
just restating that third one? We just had it looks like we just had a small glitch in the stream, and I just want to make sure that everybody catches that
sure.
third point.
So the third point to me was in many ways the most critical, because I understand people's reluctance, because they think, if you pass an income tax, it just means I'm paying more in taxes. It's not going to do a thing for my property tax. So my constitutional amendment proposal would be a requirement that any additional money from the state for public schools be met with a concurrent reduction in local school property taxes. So
Right.
that a property tax cut would be built into the this income tax proposal, to alleviate people's concerns that it's just going to be one tax on top of another.
Yeah, I was going to
Which
say
I under
that directly addresses what my primary concern was asking about this was how do you make sure that there's sort of an obligation on the local level to provide property tax relief if you
exactly.
implement some sort of new statewide uh, broad-based tax solution.
Exactly. And let me go back to the point I made earlier. The state of New Hampshire is in the top 10 for public school spending, but most of it comes from property taxes. So the issue is not how much we're spending on schools, it's how we're spending on schools, right?
Right.
It's the source of the spending. Right now, the source of the spending is on this very regressive property tax that is kind of arbitrary and has no adjustment for people's individual economic situation, um, unlike a property tax. So it was never a question of trying to raise more money for public education. It's trying to change who's paying. And so the idea would be lock in, raise money through an income tax, which by its very nature means people who with more resources, more income, are going to pay more.
Mhm.
Along with restoring the interest and dividends tax, in my view, and locking in, the requirement that any additional revenue from the state going to local school districts be met with a concurrent equal reduction in local school property taxes,
Right.
so that you lock in that cut. The other thing And I know this is another, critics will say, well, look at every other state that's ever had an income tax. The rate has just gone up and up and up.
Yep, yep, yep.
Um, I mean, one of the things that I've said is, okay, fine. So put the 3-3 plan in the Constitution. Make 3%, the cap. I
Right,
prefer a progressive tax, which is why I introduced that amendment. Um, a flat 3%. We tried in the 3-3 plan, and I know you've gone over this with Cliff and with Andrew. But one of the things that we really tried to do was make the tax as progressive as we could within the confines of the court ruling that says it's got to be a flat tax.
right.
And
And
we
I
did
think you
that
guys
with
did a good job with that in terms of just when I look at the plan, I think that's like a very like that's an appropriate like characterization that you guys it's clear that you guys made an effort to address what would perceivably be the most immediate line of attack against that plan is that like I mean I see people react to it like this anyways where they're just like, oh well, you're gonna make working people pay more money, and it's like, well no, you just didn't read the plan. you know
right, yeah. I mean, the simple thing is, if you're a family of four, the median income in New Hampshire is about $100,000. A family of
right,
four making $100,000 would pay no tax, no income tax under the three
right,
three plan.
yeah, exactly,
So, um, and we introduced, we also had the $3 statewide property tax, but we also introduced a $250,000 homestead exemption.
right,
So
right. So there's a
to
carve
try
out on the
and
property tax side of things as well.
exactly, and there's a 750 essentially $750 credit for renters,
Right,
which is
right.
about the and I was an English major. I try never to do math in public, but um, the mathematicians told me that the 750 credit for renters is about what the $250,000 homestead exemption is equivalent to. So we were trying to look out for renters as well. But that's
Right.
that's the genesis.
And
And so over time, just to conclude here, over time,
yeah,
what I realized was my fundamental concern was property taxes and giving people some relief and equity, just making a revenue scheme that was fairer, more progressive, um, and recognized that we shouldn't be asking the people with the least to pay the most. Um,
yeah, of course.
and that just made no sense to me. So over time, as we began to really study this, the 3-3 plan, and became one obvious measure, as did my amendment for an income tax, progressive income tax. So my position evolved.
Right. Yeah. And I'm loath to say that I'm sort of running out of time here, but I do there's sort of one final track that I want to go down. I want to and I think he's probably there's a high likelihood that sort of these two things are connected. I want to sort of revisit a point that brought up previously and then sort of add a little bit to it because like I said, I think they're related. So earlier one thing that I had mentioned was just the sort of disconnect between the way the money is raised and then the way it's utilized, right? So
Sure.
you can change the way you tax, you can make the way that you tax more equitable and all of that, and it's you can reduce those things, but that doesn't necessarily preclude that the way the government decides to spend the money will actually be effective, right? We have a lot of precedent in the state for them just like ignoring the Claremont decision, right? They just pay no attention to the fact that they are behaving unconstitutionally. So I think there's room in there to like for people to gain some awareness about sort of the disconnect that raising money and spending money are not the same thing. And then sort of tangential to that, which is sort of, this was alluded to with your point about just sort of the Democrats playing along with the framing that conservatives in the state have made over, decades at this point, about just the relationship to the pledge, right? That it's this sort of omniparty position that everybody just takes. And I guess like you have a minor in psychology. And so I'm just something that I'm interested in is sort of like, I think a lot of people will sort of pontificate on the why of the Democrats doing what they do in terms of this, like the logic, the sort of like emotional, like internal body chemistry response to encountering things when it's like a threat response or something to that degree, when encountering just the discussion surrounding this particular issue. And I'm not, it's like, I understand that might be sort of pseudoscientific to go down that avenue, but I also know that like you work directly with these people all the time. You have conversations with them, and so I think there's a lot that people just sort of expound upon without really understanding, and then will project conclusions based upon the what they perceive about why do the Democrats, like I say, the Democrats writ large, why does the sort of political establishment of Democrats continue to play into the framing of the conservatives within the state rather than sort of stepping back and doing what it sounds like you're doing here, which is to really say like, look, let me complexify this argument for myself and try and really understand what the intricacies of this dynamic is and why we do this, and then consider a new, totally fresh way to frame the argument of taxation to the constituency, the public, the people that are voting for us, the people that want tax relief, the people that want to find a way out of this. Why is there just a refusal to engage in imagination when it comes to providing some sort of argument that actually helps people? And there's just a consistent line of like, well, this is New Hampshire, and New Hampshire doesn't believe that, as if all people that live in New Hampshire are somehow monolithic. I mean, like I see Democrats do this. I see AOT literally just did this like recently in a clip that I saw from Granite Post. Like this is a ubiquitous thing that happens in the state. It's incredibly frustrating to me because I'm like, yeah, you say you're speaking for all Granite Staters, but like I do not feel spoken to, and I'm essentially a lifelong Granite Stater. So where like this doesn't make sense, and I feel very much so like people like me feel very excluded from that that general discussion, while also having our identities and our existences be tokenized to leverage the point that ultimately undermines our very existence. And it's just like that's very offensive. It leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. It's, I think, a huge contributor to why there's so much disillusion with the Democratic Party on the state level. I mean, you pointed out their awful track record of winning, and I think those things are related. And I guess to sort of restate it again, it's like the why. Like, why is there such an aversion to a degree of self-reflection that could lead to a reframing, expanding the complexity of the argument internally to then derive a new, simple, alternate path to express to the public why and what is going on in the state regarding equitable taxation?
Um, well, probably, I think the answer to that question is as complex um, as almost any other issue. That
Sure,
um,
yeah.
there is the Occam's razor, which is the idea that
Right.
generally the simplest answer is the correct one,
Right.
um, which is never true in politics, right?
Yeah.
There is a simple answer for every political situation, and generally the simple answer is wrong, right?
Right.
So the simple answer, uh, I think, is history. So you have Walter Peterson, Republican governor back in the early '70s, proposes an income tax. He sort of sees what's coming, and he proposes an income tax. And Mel Thompson, you know, out of Orford, New Hampshire, backed by Bill Loeb and the union leader, which was just acidic and so destructive of the political culture in New Hampshire for so long.
Right.
But Loeb and Mel Thompson craft this campaign, axe the tax, and Thompson beats Peterson in a primary, sort of not surprising, and then wins the general election. And he serves 3 terms. And in 1978, a car dealer out of Littleton, Hugh Gallen, wins the Democratic primary in his 3rd try. He tried twice before and lost in the primary each time. Wins the primary this time in 1978. And this is one of the best examples of why people who say you can't be a one-issue candidate are dead wrong. Hugh Gallen defeats Mel Thompson on the basis of construction work in progress charges at Seabrook Nuclear Plant. Public Service Company wanted to charge its customers for electricity it hadn't yet delivered because it was charging them for the construction. Gallen took the pledge, opposed an income or broad-based tax, but hammered Thompson on QUIP, on his support for QUIP. Now, Gallen ultimately won, aided enormously by the fact that the Public Service Company board of directors voted a couple of weeks before the election to give their shareholders a dividend.
Mm-hmm.
So they're crying poverty. We got to have this construction work in progress charge in order to pay for building Seabrook. But then they turn around and vote to give their shareholders a dividend. So just how poor are you? How close to the edge is your company? Gallen runs again in 1980 and wins re-election in a tough year for Democrats. In 1982, Gallen again announces for a 3rd term. He's going to seek a 3rd term. And in something that was so surprising that the reporter for the Boston Globe actually got it wrong. But when Gallen announced for the 3rd term, he did not take the pledge. And the Globe reporter actually wrote that he did take the pledge in his story, and he was wrong. And the next day, the Globe basically, the story was they blamed Gallen. They said Gallen was reversing himself when in fact it was a mistake by the Globe. Everybody else in the press corps, I was covering it for UPI. Everybody else in the press corps understood and wrote the story. The Concord Monitor got it right. The Union Leader got it right. AP and UPI got it right. The Globe got it wrong. He didn't take the pledge. Gallen ultimately lost to the scion of the Sununu family, John Sr.
Right.
And about a month after the election, Gallen died.
Oof.
And it is clear in hindsight that Gallen was ill for the whole campaign. But Democratic insiders will say, see, he didn't take the pledge and he lost.
Right.
And then you went a while before you had another Democrat, Jeanne Shaheen, in the late 90s, who took the pledge. The first time she was elected against perhaps the weakest Republican nominee ever, Ovid LaMontagne, who campaigned as a very rigid anti-abortion candidate. May have been the single worst, the only governor that I know of, certainly in the modern era, who was defeated in his first re-election attempt. He only served 1 2-year term. And Benson made many errors, and so John Lynch wins again, taking the pledge. So what you have is a history of people, and I don't think there's ever been a time, people will tell you, well, we win when we take the pledge. And I would say you win when you take the pledge, and maybe the pledge is critical to that, but you win when you're running against very weak Republican nominees,
Right.
or you've got an issue like QUIP, which is so overwhelming that, so there's this myth that has been developed: we have to take the pledge or we lose. But it's all focused on the governor's race. Nobody talks
So
about the House or the Senate.
you think it might be fair to characterize it as sort of just a bad analysis? Basically, it's in a lot of ways, it's like it's poorly reading the tea leaves of the causes and a misattribution of what factors to success are, and therefore fear around failure is based off of a preconceived notion of a specific driver of what is successful. And then I would
I
imagine
think
that there's sort of like, just to finish that thought, I just think there's probably a knock-on effect of like when you go in and you tell people this is what makes us win, this is what makes us lose, that that's coming from a position of authority, and then the people who are in the public who are sort of disengaged hear that and they're like, well, I guess that's what it means to win, right? And it's like they're sort of not, they're checked out, and they're not going to sit there and think like, well, Jesus, there another strategic path for us to victory. And it's not like, look, like there's more than one way to crack an egg, you know what I mean? Like, and I think that that lack of imagination is borne out in why this particular uh, dynamic is the case.
it's I would not say necessarily a bad analysis. I would say it's an incomplete analysis, and this goes back
Yeah,
to sort of
yeah,
my
absolutely.
notion of my notion of simple answers in politics often are wrong. In
Right,
part because they don't consider other factors. It's not as if the campaign is only about the pledge. Um, so I mean, uh, Jean Shaheen took the pledge, Ovid LaMontagne took the pledge. So obviously, the pledge didn't have a huge role in that election. So what else did?
right.
Um, and so, for example, a lot of people who were opposed to the 3-3 plan pointed to a poll done by St. Anselm's, in which,
Yes.
I think the result was 70% of the people came back responding to a question: do you support an income tax, or would you support an income tax?
Right.
And and I've worked with probably hundreds of polls over the course of my career doing political campaigns. And I
Hmm.
will tell you, that's the worst formulation of a question I've ever heard. Um,
Yeah.
because it's like, do you want a sharp stick in your eye? Who wants more taxes? No.
Right.
But if
Right.
you ask the question, would you support an income tax with a property tax cut? Put it in context. And
Yeah. Yeah.
the best example I can think of, and it's sort of reversed in terms of politics. Um, there was a poll in the mid '90s in Mississippi that asked people if they would support an increase in spending for public schools if
Hmm.
if if it if it meant better education. And I think 2/3 of the people said sure. And I had good Democratic friends and people I was working with in a gubernatorial race down there that year who were saying, see, we can talk about more money for public education. 2/3 of the people support it. I said,
Right.
yeah, but the question that didn't get asked? What? I said, we asked, would you support uh, more spending for public education to improve public education?
Right.
And 2/3 said yes. What we didn't ask was, do you believe more spending for public schools will improve public education? And I said, and I'll bet you 2/3 of the people would say no.
Right.
So the problem with polls, well, there are numerous problems these days
Yeah, I
because
was gonna
nobody's got
say.
landlines anymore. And yeah,
Right.
but you know, the difficulty with polls is how the questions are constructed and what questions don't get asked, right?
Sure.
And you always have to be thinking about, how am I asking the question? Am I injecting bias into this? Um,
Right.
UNH did a poll on the 3-3 plan, and their wording was, uh, would you support this plan, which supporters claim will reduce property taxes? Well, the word claim
Yeah,
is a
that
red
colors
light.
it, doesn't
You
it?
know,
Yeah.
it absolutely colors it. So, my understanding is, there was a poll done by a Democrat in the first district, on the 3-3 plan, in which 2/3 of the people supported it. Now,
Right.
the poll was only of Democrats, because it was a Democratic candidate in a Democratic primary.
Sure.
Um, but the fact that you had that kind of support, and I would argue, you and I both live in the second congressional district, which is more Democratic than the first.
Yeah.
And I would think if you ask the same question of Democratic voters in the second district, you get an even stronger response. So it's all in how a lot of it is how you frame the question. And
Yeah.
that was my argument to my leadership was, we have to reframe it. Now, let me say, I know we're getting on time here, but the last thing I'll say is, I think the Democratic Party missed a huge opportunity. In December of 24, as I said, I went to see House Democratic leadership, and I said, we need to become the party of property tax relief, and we should spend the next 2 years. We're down 40 seats. We're not gonna pass, best legislation. The best we can hope for is to try and stop the worst of the legislation. But we should
Right.
use the next 2 years, being out of the majority. We should use the next 2 years to push the theme that we want to cut property taxes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to me, there was look, there needs to be an educational campaign on an income tax, whether it's a 3-3 plan or a progressive tax, or there. I mean, there needs to be an educational effort across the board on how we raise revenue, and how 95% of the people are getting screwed to benefit the top 5% of wealthy corporations and individuals.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, and you can't do that in the space of a few weeks during an election campaign. So I understand that,
100%. Yeah.
but you got to start somewhere. And and just like the Claremont decision, we've had, in the case of revenue, we've had 50 years of living with this uh, weight on our shoulders that said you can't talk about revenue,
Right.
which is just crazy. Um, so we tried to start it this year with the 3-3 plan, and again and I tried on several other occasions. I introduced a bill, Carter, that would have asked the Department of Revenue Administration to come up with 5 options to raise a half $1 billion, $500 million, which is basically what it would have taken to fully fund the Judge Ruoff's opinion in the Conval case
Right. Yeah.
last summer, right? Um, get DRA, they're the experts, get DRA to do a study, come up with 5 options. I got opposed by both the Republican and Democratic leadership,
Yeah.
and only 76, actually 75 other Democrats voted with me to support that. But it was like, it's a research study. It's not imposing a tax. It's just asking
Right.
for
It's just literally
information.
trying to find in information. Yeah, exactly.
And, and leadership, like, afraid of their own shadow. And so
Yeah.
you know, they killed it. And, but so my point is, we need an educational campaign. We need people to understand that if the median income is $100,000, If you're in the lower half of that median, you're paying for the upper half.
Right.
People in the, if you divide the state into economic levels, the people in the lowest 20% making the least are paying almost 9% of their income in taxes. The top 1% are paying about 2.5% of their income in
Yeah,
taxes.
that's disgusting,
So yeah,
in my
so
opinion.
we're it's reverse Robin Hood. We're taking from the
Yeah.
poor and giving to the rich, and it needs to stop. So we need an educational campaign that starts as soon as possible. We tried to start it this year with the 3-3 plan and with my amendment to CACR 12, um, um, and as I said on the floor that day, I achieved the rare.
Right. Yeah, as I think you should be. So, all right. Well, State Representative Tom Oppel, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate you so much for setting aside the time to talk to me, and just, your willingness to sort of stand your ground against the party itself that you're a part of, and then also I think it's really admirable your willingness to sort of grow and change as you come across new information. That's not really something that I see a whole lot of these days, and I think that's something that a lot of politics would do well to see in their method. So thank you so much for your
Well,
time today.
listen, I really appreciate it. I will just say, as an English major, the poet John Keats invented the term negative capability, which meant the willingness to be comfortable with the idea of uncertainty and doubt. Um,
Yeah.
and I think it's a wonderful concept and a wonderful quality. And I always try to remember, to work on my negative capability.
Yes, yes. I completely agree, and I'm right there with you. So thanks so much, Tom. It was great talking with you today.
Thanks, Carter. It was fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Awesome. And that does it for our show today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, subscribe. You can head over to the supports Substack and Patreon, links in the description. And as for now, we will catch you guys next time. Take care.